I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm reading Chapter 14, which is Suction Up, Trickle Down, the final chapter on the section on economics, which is the Petropocalypse, from my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. In this chapter, I look at the growing wealth disparity and how that has been manipulated through college debt and housing costs. I look at who that so-called subprime mortgage crisis benefited, people like Bank of America and Barclays, since they are considered people. And I look at how even billionaires are having a hard time keeping up, and you will be forgiven for not shedding a tear. After this chapter, then the final two sections of the book go into system change and then the solution. So this is important to pay attention to because it will lay the foundation for thinking about how would you like money to work. First, let's look at how we don't want it to work. I start with a quote from Bernie Sanders. In America today, we have the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth, and more inequality than at any time period since 1928. The top 1% owns 42% of the financial wealth of the nation, while, incredibly, the bottom 60% owns only 2.3%. One family, the Walton family of Walmart, owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of Americans. In terms of income distribution in 2010, the last study done on this issue, the top 1% earned 93% of all new income, while the bottom 99% shared the remaining 7%. And this is from Tom Engelhardt in Going for Broke in Ponzi Scheme America. A society that programmatically trains its young into debt and calls that higher education is as corrupt as a wealthy country that won't rebuild its own infrastructure. Talk about the hollowing out of America. You are it. No matter how substantial you may be in private, you are being impersonally emptied in what passes for the real world. Suction up, trickle down. Tom Engelhardt is the co-founder of the American Empire Project, author of The End of Victory Culture, and editor of the online blog TomDispatch.com. In a commencement address he will never be asked to give, he douses new grads with a cold splash of reality. Today, he says, we know that the class that preceded you was the most indebted in the history of higher education, and you'll surely break that record. And no wonder, with college tuition still rising wildly, up 1,110% since 1978. Judging by last year's numbers, about 70% of you had to take out loans simply to make it through here, to educate yourself. That figure was a more modest 45% 2 decades ago. On average, you will have rung up at least $33,000 in debt, and for some of you, the numbers will be much higher. That, by the way, is more than double what it was the same 2 decades ago. We have some sense of how this kind of debt plays out in the years to come, and the news isn't good. Those of you with major school debts will be weighed down in all sorts of ways. You'll find yourselves using your credit cards more than graduates without such debt. You'll be less likely to buy a home in the future. A few decades from now, you'll have accumulated significantly less wealth than your unindebted peers. In other words, a striking percentage of you will leave this campus in the kind of financial hole that, given the job market of 2015, you may have a problem making your way out of. And now let's accelerate that to 2025. Engelhardt's message to grads is that they've been scammed, but they can take cold comfort that they're far from alone. Their professors and even their politicians have been made similarly dependent on wealthy corporate sponsors in order to survive. For every claim he makes, Engelhardt links solid and increasingly depressing research. Homes going, gone. Another Tom Dispatch blogger is Laura Gottesdiener, author of A Dream Foreclosed, Black America and the Fight for a Place to Call Home. She looks particularly at housing debt and its role in making middle-class security out of reach for all but the elite. From 2007 to 2013, more than 4.5 million repossessed homes displaced at least 10 million people, according to Gottesdiener. A disproportionate number of those affected were minority families, who were aggressively marketed subprime mortgages. Bounty-hunting agents went as far as to bribe ministers and exploit church affiliations, directing over half of minority borrowers to predatory loans, even when they qualified for better terms. 4.5 million houses for sale and 10 million renters with ruined credit produced a glut that the market couldn't digest. By 2013, the government agencies of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were left with an inventory of 90,000 foreclosed homes, with many of the other 4,410,000 sitting on the books of banks. The upside of the housing crisis should have been a return to saner prices, enabling more buyers to become homeowners after prices plummeted. After all, free market prices are set by competition between bidders. If all bidders are subject to the same constraints, the 4.5 million most eligible buyers should move into those homes. But instead, the government agencies sold them in bulk to investors like Colony Capital, which bought nearly 1,000 during a pilot program. Capital's colonies. Blackstone, the largest private equity fund and now the largest owner of single-family homes in the nation, spent over $4.5 billion to buy at least 30,000 houses, often paying in cash. GI Partners gave $1 billion to Waypoint Homes to scoop up over 4,000 houses, and Citibank extended them $250 million in credit. Major investors believe that the single-family residential asset class will serve as a natural hedge against inflation, which is redundant since property values and rents go up as the dollar loses value. No mention was made of how the wages and savings of renters will fare without this flotation device. Meanwhile, in low-rent districts and overbuilt suburbs alike, property values took a nosedive because foreclosed homes sat vacant and decrepit, bringing down the property tax base that communities depend on. Banks did not fulfill their legal obligation to maintain and market properties after they rushed through millions of robo-signed forgeries of foreclosure documents forcing owners out, sometimes at gunpoint. Due to lower property taxes, public services were slashed, further decreasing the jobs and money circulating in minority neighborhoods. True to the name of the unabashed colony capital, communities at home became capital's colonies, capitalism being the way that civilized people colonize. Locusts and money in the urban desert. Tom Engelhardt introduced a different post by Laura Gottesdiener by suggesting to media pundits that they use Detroit as the benchmark for biblical-scale catastrophe instead of Katrina. He wrote, "In a country in which Congress has trouble raising money for essential highway upkeep, not a single mile of real high-speed rail exists, the Acela Express in the Northeast being a high-speed joke. The national infrastructure gets a D+ grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers, and one of its formerly great cities makes the phrase hollowed out sound like a euphemism. Perhaps we should change our metaphors. Maybe when something devastates part of this country, it's not a Katrina any longer, but a Detroit. Maybe the next time a city is hit by a hurricane, the headline should refer to it as a 5-hour Detroit. Maybe when the next set of aging natural gas pipelines blows up, we should speak of an underground Detroit. Gottesdiener's 2015 article, A Foreclosure Conveyor Belt, The Continuing Depopulation of Detroit, highlighted the largest simultaneous property tax foreclosures in history, with tens of thousands of people evicted at the same time. 62,000 homes were slated for the auction block in 2015, half of them occupied, affecting 1 out of every 7 people in Detroit. Property tax is like the head tax that colonies of the Roman Empire identified as the first step to slavery. Whereas income is only taxed if you're paid, and sales are only taxed if you buy, everyone has to live somewhere. Home ownership gives a place to stay on the earth, a place to sleep that isn't borrowed or trespassing, a room of one's own from which one can't be kicked out. Unless you fell behind on the property tax due to a heart attack, unless you're waiting for a lump sum payment from your former job, unless your African American father, who lived through the 1967 Detroit riots, can't keep up with the taxes on his hard-won home. In the digital futuristic mock-ups of the Detroit Planning Commission, these neighborhoods were turned into water retention basins, or more simply put, ponds. The mass exodus of people made way for ducks and superior storm runoff management. It gave new meaning to whitewashing. Binging and purging on property. And what about the homes that were financially underwater, but not literally? In a 2013 article in Dollars and Cents entitled Who's Housing Recovery, Darwin Bongraham reported that high finance investors were buying up foreclosed homes by the tens of thousands. Homes were targeted in the sun and sand belts, from Florida to Georgia to Arizona, Nevada, and California. The new category of single-family rental houses was added to other asset classes like corporate debt, government bonds, currencies, and financial derivatives. By 2015, according to Barclays, 42,000 foreclosed homes had been bought for a total of $5 billion, which came to an average price of $119,000 in all-cash deals. Morgan Stanley called the growth curve the $60 billion question, while Barclays thought the potential could reach $100 to $200 billion, skimming 1.3 million homes off the market like a whale guzzles plankton. How were U.S. presidents hammered? Let us count the waves. When Glass-Steagall was repealed, banks pushed mortgages they knew would fail, while their investment divisions bet on the failure. Taxpayers bailed out the banks, whose fraudulent mortgages led to the crisis. Citibank alone received $476 billion in government assistance, including TARP funds. If Citibank had been forced to foreclose on the mortgages that were underwater, with the borrower owing more than the price at which the house would now sell, Citibank would have dropped below their required reserves, putting them into insolvency. Taxpayers saved Citibank. In return for this favor, Citibank provided a mere $1.8 billion to the borrowers it had defrauded, with which it prioritized underwater mortgages, rather than refinancing retirees who lost their houses over small equity loans. A peculiar absence of pitchforks. Bank of America's Countrywide Financial paid a fine of $335 million, a mere slap on the wrist, to settle documented claims that it had charged 200,000 minority borrowers higher rates and fees and targeted them with subprime mortgages. Besides the $45 billion that B of A received in TARP funds, the New York Fed forgave them the $15 billion they cost the government for misrepresented mortgage-backed securities. With a wink and a nod between the New York Fed and B of A, taxpayers returned a 10-to-1 profit for their discriminatory lending practices. These no-guilt settlements were merely a business expense. For the 2012 RoboSign scandal, major mortgage servicers agreed to pay $26 billion in total for evicting homeowners with false or incomplete paperwork. Each evictee received an average of $2,000 over the course of 3 years, or $55 per month. Because the federal government settled on the public's behalf without an admission of guilt from the bankers, victims can no longer sue the banks in civil court. This agreement also protected the perpetrators from any personal liability, including fines or jail time. Heads did not roll, but eyes did. The homes that were not foreclosed are the ones that should have been. These homes were part of the $700 billion that was underwater. Although it would have been painful, people who bought at the peak of the market with little or no money down would have been better served to walk away and rent elsewhere. The banks, however, couldn't afford to foreclose on these houses and recognize the $700 billion in losses. Owners of these troubled assets had their principals reduced thanks to government subsidies that were really a gift from us to the bankers and not to the homeowners, who were still left owing more than the house was worth. One man's castle is another man's shovel. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that housing demonstrates the greatest class disparity in percent of income spent. A low-income family that makes under $18,000 a year will spend $10,000 per year on housing, or 56% of their income. Their total expenses will equal $25,000 per year, even though they bring in less than that in gross pay. Some of this is made up in programs like food stamps, which aren't counted as income, yet housing will still be 40% of their total expenditures. The hypothetical average family who does have more coming in than going out spends 26% of their income on housing, which is 34% of their total expenditures. In 2011, this mythical family spent $50,000, altogether of their $65,000 income. But while the average family income was $65,000, the median family income was only $51,000, which means they barely made more than they spent. Census data for 2011 showed higher incomes levels than the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but reflected a similar income gap between the median family income of $62,000 and the average family income of $83,000. The difference was that 48% of all income was made by the top 10% of wage earners. The top 10% averaged $250,000 per household and spent an average of $38,000 per year on housing, which was only 15% of their income. Half of their income, or $125,000, wasn't spent at all. But the amount of savings by the top 10% was in turn skewed by the top 1%, who have a habit of hanging on to their wealth. The 1%, those 3 million Americans whose annual family earnings were in excess of $400,000, saw their incomes rise 20% in 2012, compared to a 1% increase for the other 99%. By 2013, the 1% was garnering 95% of all income gains. And then there's the top 0.01% who make over $10 million a year. By 2013, they were making nearly 1,000 times as much as the bottom 90% of society, which was an exponential rise over 1975 when it was only 100 times as much. 1 in a million. But even the wealthy are subject to their own disparity gap. In 2011, the Swiss bank USB and the research firm WealthX compiled a list of the global 200,000. These were the 0.003 of the world who held at least $30 million each and a combined wealth of $28 trillion. Far from trickling down, this total escalated up by another $2 trillion in 2012. A third of these ultra-rich were Americans, 65,000 people, or one person out of every 5,000 Americans, with a combined wealth of over $9 trillion. This was over half of the then U.S. GDP of $16 trillion. If every person earned an equal share of the U.S. GDP, it would have come to $50,000 per man, woman, and child, or $200,000 for a family of 4. Clearly, this money went somewhere else. But even that wasn't all. It turned out that 1% of the 200,000 ultra-rich, or the 2,000 billionaires who made up the global 0.00003%, held 23% of this elite group's total net worth. This is only one person for every 3.5 million people in the world. In 1960, the GDP of the world was $1.35 trillion. 2 generations later, 2,000 individuals owned 6 times this, $7.4 trillion, or over 10% of the $72 trillion global GDP in 2011. This money was extracted from the productive economy to become speculative capital. Michael Moore tracked this migration of wealth in an article called The Forbes 400 versus Everybody Else. Moore calculated total U.S. wealth as $53 trillion in 2009. The bottom 60% shared only 2.5% of this, putting their total wealth at $1.22 trillion. The aggregate wealth of the 2009 Forbes 400 was more than this, at $1.27 trillion. So an average person on the Forbes 400 monopolized more capital than 450,000 people combined in the U.S. But there's no rest for the weary in the race to the top. In 1982, when Forbes first started assembling their list of the 400 richest Americans, there were only 13 billionaires. In 2012, the average net worth of the Forbes 400 rose $800 million to reach $5 billion each, so that less than $1.3 billion didn't even make the cut. The combined wealth of these 1 in every million Americans topped $2 trillion. Poor little billionaires, keeping up with the Gates, Buffetts, Bezoses, Zuckerbergs, and Cooks has never been so competitive. A tale of two middles. The consistent pattern of increasing money concentration makes it clear that this is a systemic problem, not a few greedy individuals at the top, some lazy bums at the bottom, and spendthrifts in the middle who use their houses as ATM machines. The problem goes deeper than can be fixed by a few policy tweaks or changing some key players. In illustration of this, the Congressional Research Service compared the mean and median of household net worth going back to 1989, sourced from 2010 Federal Reserve data. And I will summarize this. Starting in 1989, the average household net worth was 4 times the true middle class, defined as those who are in the middle of society with half the population above and half below. This discrepancy indicates that the 1989 distribution, if plotted on a line, was an exponential curve, with the so-called average household worth $313,000. They would actually be in the top 10% wealth bracket. The rest of the money was squeezed out of the 90% like an empty toothpaste tube. In fact, so much money was extracted to the top that they would have to give $234,000, the mean subtracted by the median, to every household to create a straight diagonal line from poorest to richest. For the next 6 years, from 1989 to 1995, the median and mean came closer together as the middle class made modest gains, and the upper class had modest losses. During the 12 years of 1995 to 2007, they both climbed steadily, with the wealthy gaining more than the middle class. If we divide the number of people in the U.S. by 2.5 people per household, and then multiply by the average net worth, total U.S. wealth went from $31 trillion in 1989 to $70 trillion in 2007, or more than double. Once again, however, what increased wasn't the real wealth, but the monetary value attributed to it. The natural capital of forest and fossil fuels went down. The physical capital of housing and infrastructure aged and depreciated, and although the population increased by 22%, the human capital of U.S. skills and education suffered from neglect. In the same way, when a house goes up or down in value, the beauty or functionality of the house doesn't necessarily change, just the hypothetical sale price. By the height of the housing bubble, the median had made a net gain of 60%, while the average had climbed 87%. This may not seem like a big difference, but subtracting the median from the average, it means that the richest 1% could now afford to give $400,000 in value to each household and still be at the top of the line. Stop and imagine for a moment what this would mean in terms of quality of life if each household had $400,000 more in assets and security. Sweeping up. Imagine now if that $400,000 per household was a share of the community's capital, ownership of, and therefore responsibility for, part of the joined wealth in land, property, infrastructure, skills, creativity, and knowledge. The credit extended from this shared wealth would enable households to enhance their private capital, fix up old homes, learn new skills, and start small businesses. The community would be able to subsidize agriculture that improves the soil, construction that restores the infrastructure, and services that enhance wellness and happiness. No matter what happened to the monetary value, these things could never be taken away. But monetary value isn't wealth, and hypotheticals can evaporate, as happened when the bottom fell out of the housing market, and this imaginary wealth dropped to $62 trillion in 2010, merely twice its level 2 decades previous. While the climb in wealth had advantaged the upper class, in the drop, the middle class lost more net worth than they'd gained since 1989. They had accrued an additional 60% since 1989, but lost it all and plummeted an extra 2%. The upper class lost a mere 15% from their peak value in 2007, but kept gains of 59% over their 1989 net worth. They now held $421,000 of excess value from each of the 124 million households in the U.S. rather than $234,000. In 1989, a middle-class household needed to quadruple their net worth in order to be average. By 2010, they needed to own 6.5 times as much. To make matters worse, the $77,000 of value the median did own represented only half as much health care, half as much education, and half as much house as it did in 1989. The rest of the dollar's value had migrated up to the wealthiest 1%. It's as if the influx of monetary value acted like a broom to sweep the real wealth into the far reaches of the upper echelon, creating a 6.5-fold discrepancy between median and average. Explaining this, the Congressional Research Service observed that during boom times, the average net worth grew faster than the median, but during recessions, the median fell faster than the mean. In other words, in good times, the rich get richer, and in bad times, the poor get poorer. A rising tide lifts all boats, as they say, but when it recedes, the yachts fare far better than the rest of our sinking dinghies. And then with each chapter, I end with a lexicon and paradigm shifts and discussion question. The paradigm shift in this was 4 things rise with income: housing, healthcare, higher education, and hope for retirement, or the unaffordable 4H. For necessities, our economic system is designed to take everything a person has, and when their savings and borrowing capacity are exhausted, socialize the rest of the cost. The populace pays in cash, credit, or taxes, and the 0.0001% always profits. There is no middle class. Therefore, only a precarious median muddling through. For more on this topic, here is Home is Where the Hearth Is, and how we can put the fire economy back where it belongs. And this one is the Reset's 3 agendas, looking at dispossession, depopulation, and psychological manipulation. Thanks for sticking with this difficult chapter that is very fact and data heavy, and I am looking forward to moving into imagining what it could be.